Okay, and we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Feedback Fridays with your hosts, Robert and myself. The format of this show is that we have a dabbler submitted piece of work that they want feedback on, and to give everybody here and everyone watching after a glimpse into the feedback process, we tackled it from two different perspectives. Myself, I tackle it as a line editor, Robert tackles it as a beta reader, and we give perspective from those two lenses. This week we had someone that's been in a bunch of our events every now and then, so it was nice to see. It was Renee, or RL Platt, who submitted a sci-fi work called Bionics and Parasites, and it was good. It was nice to see a sci-fi piece. It was a good introductory piece, and yeah, it was just a lovely read. So Pat's here. Good morning, Pat. Welcome. Hope all is well. If you are joining us, feel free to say good morning and hello in whatever chat you're joining us from. But yeah, Robert, any big ideas or anything before we dive into this one?
No, I am a fan of sci-fi, so I'm excited about this one. So
Yeah, that was my first thought too when I saw the genre. Was that, oh, Robert's gonna like this one.
yeah.
Hello, TW. Good afternoon to you. And TW's from the UK. I'm 99% sure on that one. So yes, living in the future. And for Robert, it's what, 9 in the morning for you?
Yes. So I'm
Joining
living
us
in the
nice and
past.
early. All right. Well, we'll I don't think we need to dilly-dally. I think we can hop right into it. So, as always, Robert, do you want to kick us off with beta feedback?
Sure. Yeah. For those who haven't been here before, the feedback that we're going to give is I kind of give the beta reader feedback just strictly as a reader with some writing experience, which in my experience has been more helpful than maybe just a reader who's read a lot but hasn't actually written. And so yeah, I've been in multiple writing groups. I've given lots of feedback as a beta reader, and so I won't be giving any line edit stuff or any specific prescriptive suggestions. That being said, that's what Doug is here for. Sorry, I think I'm coming down with something. If my voice is very scratchy, but Doug is here as the editor, so he will be giving some great suggestions on things to fix, things that were great about the piece, and other stuff like that. So, yeah. Looks like Pat is in Sonora, so that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's get started here. So for my feedback, I give it in kind of two parts. So I have my wins, my positive feedback, and then areas of improvement. And so we'll start with just kind of an introduction for the audience that doesn't know this piece. Just a quick summary of what happens in this submission is we have a bionic or a seems like a robot, a sentient AI of some sort that is traveling to Dabbler Station, and I appreciate the the nod. Like, okay, it is a little on the nose, but Doug and I both agree that flattery will get you everywhere in our case. So, but this bionic being is transporting goods to Dabbler Station, and has an interaction with like a merchant trying to sell some of their wares, and then they are looking for some repairs, it seems, to their computer system, their internal system, and they are sent to go talk to a human about it. And there's a little hints of world building in here where these bionic beings have just won a war previously to this, very recently in the last year in the setting of the story, where they have won their independence from the oppressive humans. And so, interesting world building details, kind of a classic sci-fi setup. I like very first thing, just in terms of overarching feedback, is I've really enjoyed the opportunity to be in the head of a bionic being. I think that's
Mm,
a really cool just setup. As a fan of sci-fi, um, I think we get a lot of. Uh, this is clearly not in the first story to do that, but I think kind of the trope is that there's like a plucky robot companion rather than the protagonist being robotic or bionic. Um, and so that is one of the first things, just like high concept, that I liked.
mhm.
But yeah, so we'll get into some more of the specific stuff that I did like.
Did you before you dive in, just on that trope, did you watch those Rebel Moon movies on
I did
Netflix?
not.
Okay, well, I mean, you should, just to say you watched them, but maybe we can do a whole deep dive into why these movies weren't great from a
Okay.
storytelling perspective. But they had Anthony Hopkins voicing a robot that was
Mm,
in the first part of the first movie, then runs away into nature, then like starts wearing antlers, and then at the end, in the climax of the second movie, comes back and just helps the good guys shoot everyone, and then that's it.
okay.
So it is refreshing. I agree with you. It is refreshing to be inside the head, quite literally, in
Hmm.
this writing, inside the head and network of a bionic being, rather than just having them kind of shoved over into a nothing role that just kind of enhances the flavor of the world. It's cool.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, first, some things that I loved about this piece. Number one is I'll just share little snippets that kind of go along with this on the screen here, but they're kind of in the first couple paragraphs, we get that this being is going to the station and is trying to protect themselves against catching these nasty electronic bugs, which is a really cool world building detail. And then as we kind of progress through the story and we find out that they have just gotten out of a war with the humans, it would make sense that there might be some particularly nasty bugs for the bionic beings, just floating around. And so I liked that detail. It kind of grounded me in the story, and just kind of those mundane little things where it's just like, if there's a if there's a disease outbreak, you're going to wash your hands more often or wear a mask or something like that. And just those little mundane details, but from like a bionic being, a robot of sorts, was a really cool detail. So I really liked that one. Um, a lot of the things I liked what were in the descriptions of things and kind of the setup as we kind of get into the story. And so there is a bit of this is a description of Dabbler Station, um, which just basically explains what Dabbler Station is. And again, we're kind of leaning into sci-fi tropes here, but I don't think that's a bad thing. Where it's a crammed space station, which just makes sense with the logistics of space travel. And so there was a lot going on, and it also kind of endeared me to the protagonist a little bit, because it kind of goes into how the protagonist can get a little overwhelmed at Dabbler Station, because they are more accustomed to just traveling by themselves out in space. And so with that in mind, this description, this detail was fun, and it also, like, you always run a risk when when your protagonist or a character or a point of view character is not a human, of like making them feel very foreign to our lived experience, right? And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes that's what the author wants, is to make it feel really alien and outside of the human experience. But with the story being told here by Renee, I think that we are much I think that Renee's trying to lean closer to like um, these bionic beings have shared experience with us, and humans won't have to protect against, digital viruses just floating around a space station, so to speak. But they they do still get overwhelmed by a large crowd and lots of sound and things like that. And so I thought that was a really good detail that also helped kind of character build as well. So not only was it cool world building, but it helped build up the character in my mind. Would you agree with that, Doug?
Yeah, I would actually. And I didn't even, because I'm looking at this through a line editor's perspective, I didn't necessarily pick up on that as much. But now that you're saying it, it's like the bionics are human enough, but distinctly inhuman, that it really it gives you a unique experience being inside Noir, I think is the main character's name, inside her head, or
Mm-hmm.
inside their head. Um, and yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head there. That's a very good point.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Again, another world building detail that I liked. This is kind of a discussion of the uh, of like post-war stuff. So it's our kind coexisted in a state of equality now, unlike the first corporate-funded system. Traveler starships. Yeah, sorry, I can't fit too much text in here, so it's a little disjointed here, but from original Earth and Bionics had been corporate property, and so just giving us a little detail on what actually happened. And again, we are kind of leaning into robot uprising trope territory, but it, most of those tropes are following along with the evil robot uprising, and humans, and like, yeah, we gotta crush them, let's blow them up with big missiles kind of thing. And this case, it's more interesting because we are in a bionics head, and from that perspective. And so again, just good history and world building that also fits the scene, because this is when our main character Noir is having like an altercation with a human who just seems to be very much prejudiced against bionics. And so it fits into the story, and it's also just good world building. And so I think for those of you who may be watching and maybe aren't into sci-fi, you might be like, why is he just loves world building? And so typically for us sci-fi readers, like, this is our bread and butter. This is what we love, this is what we want. Like, give me some of the details, tell me what the setting looks like, where are we in space. Like, those are some things I think sci-fi and fantasy readers just have a really high threshold on, like, before we get bored in terms of world building details. And so if this weren't a sci-fi piece, I would say, like, maybe pare it back a little bit, like maybe give us a little more character moments. But because this is a sci-fi piece, I think that it's fitting well. And like I said, I think it's well placed in the narrative. So it's not feeling like it's forced or anything. I think it's just, yeah, good moments there. So, okay. And then, and then there's actually a really funny moment that I just loved, where Noir, our main character, is talking to this merchant. Areo is their name, and they are also a bionic being, and so they have this cool and interesting interaction. And again, it is like a very simple trope, and where, like, you have this merchant who's trying to, like, swindle you out of your goods, right? And again, like I say, it's a trope, but I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think that it fits in the scene. I think that it's fun. And they have this kind of antagonistic relationship. And then Noir goes into this into this, like, little moment where they say, at times like this, I wish I owned a blaster or projectile weapon. Pulling out and targeting someone with an inordinately expensive, prohibited, and lethal firearm was not polite, not good manners at all, but some situations just called for it. This situation did not, but I would have felt better having the option available. And I thought that was just really fun, just like a great line that just really endeared me to the character, um, because they're just like daydreaming about, like, just like wanton violence with Areo, but then like realizes like this is not the situation where I should probably pull out a weapon and
That's
actually
rude.
threaten someone. Yeah, that's very rude. And so it was very fun and just very like silly and but also like the fact that a robot is concerned about not good manners, but also in terms of like a firearm, where it's like that's manners is like that's a crazy thing to ascribe to firearm safety. Um, so it was just like I don't know. I thought that was a really good moment. Um, yeah. So especially in the context of a story. So
Yep.
yeah. And then yeah, I think the final thing is I kind of mentioned in the summary, but the scene kind of ends um, with Noir needing some kind of repair to their internal systems, and so Noir goes off to asks this merchant Areo who they can go to try and find this repair or get some kind of software update or something along those lines. And then Areo sends them to a human. Um, and that I think there's two really good moments that happen here because this is kind of Areo says like go here in the station and ask for Hammond, and this is Noir's response, and Noir says a human, and then just kind of states that like that sounds like a very human name, that doesn't sound like a bionic name, um, and I think this response it sets up some interesting character interaction because this chapter kind of focuses on some of the conflict between bionics and humans, and so it kind of takes us where we already kind of wanted to go with taking Noir into a situation with a human directly, and just seeing how that plays out if the human is being nice because we get a little bit of an altercation with a rude human, um, but I think this is good, but it also does some very interesting character building where there's there's kind of this uh, Noir gets this righteous moment with this human that is just like using essentially a slur against the bionics, um, but then the moment, like this moment, does some interesting character building where now some of Noir's prejudice against humans comes out in this moment. And it's not that it's unearned prejudice since they just won a war for independence from the humans, right? But this moment where Noir is like dubious because it is a human actually leads to a character flaw and perhaps something that could be something that could be improved in the future in terms of like thinking maybe not all humans are bad or something like that. And it's just subtle, it's very small with this little detail of like you're sending me to a human, like, but there is just that little bit of prejudice of like even asking that question that I think was an interesting detail and was very subtle and that I appreciated in just setting up some character growth or character conflict. So
Yeah, I agree. This whole chapter was excellent in setting up this world, and that's kind of from like a plot structure perspective. That's what you want to do with the first chapter, right? It's always that ordinary world, unless you're starting like in medias res, like in the midst of things, then
yes,
that's different. But for most things, especially for stuff like sci-fi and fantasy, setting up what the world is, what it looks like, introducing to us in pieces, and these are very digestible pieces. Um, that's what you want to aim for. I think it really succeeded there.
yeah, totally. Okay, so with that, like I said, I really enjoyed this piece. Those are my positive points. I just have a few areas of improvement here. And just to start off, this is kind of the first line that we get dropped into for this, and it says all habitat pledges sounded the same, and then it just goes into what seems like a legal contract that our protagonist has to sign in order to enter Dabbler Station. And uh, while that is an interesting detail, Um, it was a bit of a slower start for me. I would have preferred to drop in a bit later than this scene, especially since this is like the first line. And that might not be the case for you, Doug, but for me and my experience, I there's kind of the have you heard like in late out early with constructing a scene? Just the concept that like get in late so you're more into the action,
Mm-hmm.
and then get out early. You don't have to explain what's happening between scenes if they're just traveling somewhere.
Right.
And so I think this scene specifically might benefit from getting in a little bit later, at least in my opinion. Just because this doesn't, it's not like, not every intro has to hit really hard, right? Like you don't have
Right.
to just say like, you don't have to start with an explosion to get my attention, but starting with just some legalese on what it takes to get into the station, while it is an interesting world building detail, I prefer to be grounded in the character. And so which does happen later, right? We get that the character is overwhelmed by the like the wealth of people and sounds that are available on Dabbler Station. And so I almost wish that we kind of started with more of those details, just to kind of ground me in the character, rather, because even the character seems bored by this, which again is a valid emotion to like show your character having. But I might have I think I would have preferred a little bit more of like the emotional, like character building side of things to get us started on this chapter, because it is chapter one of Renee's piece. And so since it is chapter one, it's the first line, I'm just going to be a little more picky about, please try and grab me with this first line. But I don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Doug?
I so I liked getting to know that kind of legalese part of it, but I think I agree in that it's not the most effective opener. So for those watching, this is just the first line of that, but it's really like 5 or 6 lines of it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's interesting. I think it does a good job of showing the like mundanity of something like getting into this station. But what could have been more effective, I think, is that we learn that Noir hates all this hustle and bustle, hates the stress of all the noise and whatnot. So why not show them like in line? They've docked, they're in line, they're waiting. There's all this noise stressing them out, and then throw in snippets of the thing blaring the legalese, like one line here, and then she's agitated or they're agitated and someone bumps into them, or there's an argument somewhere, and then they hear another line, and then some other detail that really plays up their emotions, or how much they don't want to be there, or how frustrating this whole thing is. I think there's a way to work in this cool piece of world building, but do it in a less block text kind of way.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Thank you for bringing that up, because I'm not trying to say like cut this detail, because I think it
Mm-hmm.
is cool detail.
Yes.
But like you said, I think kind of using the that experience of being overwhelmed, in conjunction with this or something else, you can take just that, my emotional feedback, in terms of like, this is how I am reacting to it, and then be creative with it, and
Yeah.
build from there. So yeah, so the next detail that and this is one that I think is easy for, like, I fall into this all the time, is there is kind of this moment that we get, that I've talked about in my good feedback, where um, where Noir, our main character, hears a human kind of being mean to another bionic. And so the human uses the word cyborg, which in this world building detail is a slur against the bionic beings. And so this is really tricky territory. Have you what is it called? It was a Detroit Become Human. Have you played that game or
Oh,
heard
no, I
anything about
haven't.
that game?
I've
Okay.
heard really good things, but
Yeah, it's a really interesting narrative video game to play through. It is really just heavy storytelling kind of thing. However, they did get some pushback because the story was very heavily just influenced by racism in the way that humans experience it. And it was a similar situation for the story that was told. I think they told a good story, but this is some tricky territory to explore. And specifically with this interaction, it felt a bit manufactured to me, in the sense that I'll just kind of run through what happens in the interaction. So the human is rude, trying in like a commerce sort of way with a bionic being, and then um, Noir kind of has this moment of just like confronting this human and says, like, just trying to correct this human that, that the human shouldn't treat bionic beings that way. um, and then the human just kind of brushes it off and says, "Yeah, whatever." And then Noir kind of gets a moment of just like saying, "Yeah, well, we won the war and freed ourselves from control." So with this, there's a couple things that kind of went strange for me in this interaction. For this first one, there's this moment of a quick rush of memories cascaded through my mind. All the times I've been ordered to perform a task, to risk my body, or to remain silent, all intrinsically tied to that word, meaning cyborg. And rather than, this is one of those situations where I think rather than showing me, or you should show, don't tell in this case, rather than telling me that they kind of are, this character is just having an introspective moment, I would like to see just a physical reaction to this interaction. And so that's my first bit of feedback. But then this is this is what Noir responds to this man. The man says, like, since when is this a problem? And then Noir says, since we won the war and freed ourselves from your control 5 years ago, do better, or you might have to not have a chance to any longer. And so this is like an interesting, because then what happens after that is Noir stomps away. And so with that, it just kind of feels like this human said something mean, and then Noir got their moment to correct them, and then stomps away. And that's what I mean with, like, it feels like a manufactured moment to me, where I almost wanted the human to be more awful. I've almost wanted the human, because we just got out of this war for independence, right? And so, like, if people and bionics had died on both sides, like, I feel like there would be much higher tension with a human that does not care about, like, a bionic's feelings, kind of thing. So I almost wanted the human to be more awful, which, like, for the purposes of a story, right? Like, I think in terms of in terms of discrimination, never okay in real life.
Yeah.
But in terms of trying to, like, sell this bias, then I think we needed a little bit more awfulness from the human, and I don't think we should give Noir, our protagonist, I don't think we should give Noir just an easy win, like you just get to dunk on them and walk away.
Mm-hmm.
I almost wanted some kind of like physical altercation or something. I don't know. I kind of wanted more from that interaction rather than Noir just gets to dunk on them and walk away. Or even like outright threaten them with, do better or you might not have the chance to any longer. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that feels like really incendiary language to be able to just like ease back into the crowd and get out of there. And so that's my feeling on that. But I don't know, what are your thoughts on that portion, Doug?
Before I dive into that, I do want to address TW's comment here, because it is tied to what I'm going to say. And are controversial topics like that generally avoided? Absolutely not. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Storytelling is a medium to convey themes and messages, right? And so from this interaction, we know that a theme of Renee's book is, or of R.L. Platt's book, is going to be discrimination and like an allegory for racism, which
Mm-hmm.
is great. The problem is that when you have such an important topic and such a real topic for a lot of people, if you go heavy handed like that and then kind of do an easy out, like Robert explained, it doesn't it doesn't convey the message in as deep a way or as meaningful a way as you want. So no, don't ever avoid controversial topics, because like that's what makes writing, right? Even if you're
Mm-hmm.
writing cool sword fights like I do, there still should be meaning behind what you're doing. As far as this whole scene goes, I agree. I think themes like this, or themes in general, are something that you start layering, right? You start
Mm-hmm.
with a little sprinkling here and there, then you add another layer in the next chapter, and throughout the entire book, you're building this out. What would have been interesting here is if we didn't have such a clean resolution, like you said, if it was more inflammatory, and then maybe Noir got in this guy's face, but then the bionic that was being discriminated against asked Noir to back off and like, no, it's okay, don't worry. I hear it all the time, that sort of stuff. Because then as a reader, we're like, that really stinks, like that's terrible. We don't want that. We don't want this person to feel like they have to accept this gross language at them. Noir
Mm-hmm.
leaves angry. The bad guy feels like he's won. It's chapter one. We don't need the protagonist to have easy wins.
Mm-hmm.
Alternatively, you can have more humans who share the sentiment come in and force Noir to back off. And then you see that, hey, this discrimination isn't isolated to this one wealthy dude. It's all these people around share the same sentiment in this post-war era.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the way that you phrase it is not having her being able to just dunk on him and walk off. You're right. I think that's spot on, because it is too easy, and it does feel like it cheapens the message a little bit. A message that should be spread across the entire thing. Show us here how bad things are. Don't let her win right now.
Yeah. And then another thing to TW's comment is it is important, especially when approaching topics like this, to note that Doug and I are two cisgender white males,
Yeah.
and so we are some of the, from lived experience, the least qualified people to be a beta reader, or more specifically when approaching these topics, there are sensitivity readers out there who, for everything from, disabled people to deaf people, to anything, like anything you're including in your story, um, like especially if it's not your lived experience, you're just not going to get it all right, and so um like, I took a an American Sign Language class in college, and it was so awesome because it was about deaf culture as well as American Sign Language, and I just learned so much about like how much of a different world that deaf people live in, and how similar it is in so many ways, right? But just little details that I would never have thought of had I not actually interacted with deaf people, such as like personal space is just a different concept for the deaf community, where like if you're in a crowded room at a party and you want to get past some people who are talking, for us hearing people, we just say, "Hey, excuse me," and then we just kind of slide on through, right? But that's not an option for the deaf community. So at those party situations, they'll just like lightly touch your shoulders and just nudge you in the direction they need you to go so they can get past. And that, like, just those little details are so rich in terms of their lived experience. And so in this case, in this hypothetical, if you were to include a deaf character, this would be a great opportunity to find a deaf sensitivity reader to make sure that if you are a hearing person, that you are getting that the experience you are writing aligns with their lived experience. And then not every deaf person will have the same lived experience, but that is something very important to keep in mind, um, because it just helps make sure that you are writing something that is authentic to that lived experience. as much
Yeah.
as you can, right? And so including people of those demographics in the conversation when you're writing your story. Even just on Reddit and things, you can just throw up a section and be like, hey, I have a deaf character, but I haven't interacted with the deaf community very much. Like, does this feel accurate? Like, you'll get plenty of responses and reactions, and you'll be able to like figure that out. And so I just want to add that little note of like a sensitivity reader can be really, really helpful when you're approaching these more controversial topics. And just to make sure that it is feeling accurate and feeling valuable. So,
Yeah. And we don't know Renee's lived experience.
mhm,
But especially from just a storytelling perspective, it is like if you're going to portray a theme, and you should, then you want it to be less cut and dry. You want it to be more nuanced. You want it to be longer. So just sow the seeds here. Make it really bad for our main character. Make it like just not a pleasant experience, and then we can empathize with her more. Because coming
mhm,
out of this, Noir won this confrontation. So like,
mhm.
yeah, cool. They did a good job, but what does that mean for character development and us relating to them?
Yeah.
Um, I
Yep.
did share an article about sensitivity readers from W in the chat there. If you want to learn more about them, very cool job, very important job too.
Yeah. And yeah, so that is kind of the rest of my feedback. Just on an overarching thing, I would like to see this may not happen in this chapter, right? But I from a world building perspective, just a final point of like maybe this isn't even necessarily negative feedback, but just saying since this war for independence for the bionic people happened so recently, I would want to see more detail about the after effects of that. Not just in the character interactions, like we just mentioned, but also like if there was damage to Dabbler Station, or like there are some other good details, like Noir got their ship for like just basically salvaged it from like a war zone, and so it's damaged and kind of a kind of a piece of junk that they have to continue to repair. And so just like most of all, just like kind of keep that up in terms of making sure that we really do feel the weight of that war that just ended, because post-war settings should be kind of brutal in all honesty, because yes, there's peace, but there's always a winner and a loser, and the loser is never happy about it. And so there's just a lot of really interesting story details that you can include using that. And so my final piece of feedback is I just want more of that. But
Mhm.
sorry, I went extra long on this piece. So
No, you you know sci-fi better than I do, so I was really interested in hearing your feedback here. What I would add is that anyone who's been to the events that I have with Hank, you've heard me go on and on about how important backstory is for a character. Like backstory informs literally everything that they do, especially in the first chapter and for the first like act or two. But backstory is also important for the world as a whole, right? We're told this war happened, but we don't really see too much of the after effects of it. We are told there's some like segregation, there's some humans only spots and some bionics only spots, and Dabbler Station tends or is this place where they kind of commingle. But beyond that one incident, we don't see any like any fallout from it, any attitudes from either side about people who were just their enemies not too long ago, right? We don't see any of the physical fallout of it. We don't see economic fallout from it. So there's a lot more that can be. There's a lot of world building that's done, but it's all very current. Here's what is, not what happened and caused some of this stuff. So
yeah, totally agree.
okay, I'm going to launch into some line editing feedback now, and I think it was good that you went as detailed as you did too, because as a line editor, I can comment on some world building things, but that's not what my job is. My job is to help with the phrasing and the word choice and the flow, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's why we do these two different perspectives for Feedback Fridays, because it gives you that more comprehensive view, and that's why it's not just Like writing, you can't just finish your first draft, get it copy edited, and then send it off, right? That's not good enough to get comprehensive feedback and make the best book you can. So I'm going to share some examples so you can see it on screen here. So yeah, bionics and parasites from Renee here. So I always lead off with what feedback looks like, and this was in a Microsoft Word document. I think we've only had Google Docs before this, but you'll see track changes, you'll see comments on the side. So I wanted to start off with something awesome, which is the narrative tone. And this is just after Nora got onto the station and is reflecting on that legalese that she heard. Don't use weapons on the station. Don't physically harm another being. Don't put holes in the airlock walls, damage the air filters, or mess with the gravity generators. Pay promptly for any purchases made, and please come again. That was the Dabbler Station Creed. I approved. You get her just running through these rules and be like, yep, makes sense. And it really kind of lends itself to let you know what her attitude is of stuff like rules in this whole situation, but also just more of her voice. So I think that by listing them off really in the punchy manner, then it helps with the tone. This one is a little one, but it's such an important one that I think people can benefit from grasping, and that's unnecessary words. So like any self-respecting bionic being, I rechecked all of my personal firewalls and increased the number of malware sweeps my cerebral processing cortex performed before moving over to access the small personal airlock hatch. You might be thinking, what is the unnecessary word here, right? These are all sci-fi words. It's all adding to the thing. It's of. It is just that one little word, because if we go here, like any self-respecting bionic being, I rechecked all my personal firewalls and increased the number of malware sweeps, ... You don't miss the of, right? We're in a day and age where most style guides and publishers want you to limit those sorts of words. So of and that, I told them that I rechecked all my personal firewalls. I told them I rechecked all my personal firewalls, right? Like these are unnecessary words that you can drop because they just slow down your flow and slow down the pacing. So that's an easy one to look out for. It also, when you include them, it can have a tendency to add a little bit of vagueness to it. This isn't a good example, and I don't think there were any of that in Renee's work, but it can lead to some muddled understanding. So the more concise you can be without sacrificing quality, the better. Okay, now let's talk about flow for a second here, because this is a really cool character / world building point. But after confirming pressurization and triple checking all the connection points, I quickly braided back the thick white radio synthesizing tendrils that hung from the back of my head like human hair. The slight reduction in their function, turning solar radiation into energy for my body, which resulted from being tucked away, was worth it to avoid potentially losing any. The issue with this one comes from the second line. The slight reduction in their function, turning solar radiation into energy for my body. So we have a comma there telling us what their function is. Not really anything wrong with that, which resulted from being tucked away. Now we have a segment of the line referring to the slight reduction, not the function itself. So we have a little bit of a flow issue there because that's not how our minds want to process. Was worth it to avoid potentially losing any reduction in any further reduction in function, any tendrils themselves, any energy. Like it's a little vague there as well. So there just needs to be a little bit of rewording because this is a little bit of a jumpy sentence. And I'm waving my mouse around pointing at things, but I'm confident no one can see my mouse on the stream. So that's okay. I think we all get where I'm pointing at here. So this is what it looks like if I were to provide feedback on this, just suggesting a new way to phrase it. And I've included the original a little faded at the bottom here, but after confirming pressurization, triple checking all the connection points, I quickly braided back the thick white radio synthesizing tendrils that hung from the back of my head like human hair. Tucking them away meant a slight reduction in their function. Then we used an M dash to make a more distinct away from the sentence, turning solar radiation into energy for my body, but it was worth it to avoid potentially losing any of them. So we've done a couple things here. We've made that more distinct cutaway so that we have that like change in flow, but we've also rearranged the sentence so it's tucking them away meant a slight reduction in their function rather than the slight reduction in their function, then the function, which resulted from being tucked away. Like it just makes it flow a little better, makes everything connect a little bit more. Does that sentence sound better to you, Robert?
Certainly, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, excellent. Something I really, really liked that Renee did were sensory descriptions, because I think so. Let's just read this first. The hustle and bustle of Dabbler Station grew exponentially as I walked deeper into the trenches and alleyways of the space market. The sound of human voices, the smell of engine oil and sweat, the rough texture of metal planking under my boots, and the tingling hum of electronics all combined into a glorious symphony, evidence of life in the vastness of space. There are so many authors, especially new authors, that just rely on sight and sometimes hearing. But there's so much more that we experience as people or bionics when we enter a space that lends to bring that space to life. And so many people sleep on smell and texture, especially the rough texture of metal planking under my boots. Like I immediately knew that's like that hollow clang, clang, clang kind of thing as you're walking. The smell of engine oil and sweat, ugh, gross. So it just adds a lot more to it than if you were to say, there were a bunch of people around working on machinery and sweating. Machines were vibrating and there was metal on the floor. Like obviously, it would be more poetic about it if you're writing, but by adding these sensory descriptions, top tier. Try and add more of that. What
Mhm.
I would say is that you can try and be a little more nuanced or subtle about it than just listing off four details with four different senses in the same sentence. You can spread it out a little bit more. You can do two or three here and then another two or three somewhere else. Not that there's six senses, but like mixing up the the different senses. Um, we have, just before I move on, TW, I need a whole workshop on M dashes. Oh, and Pat agrees. They're my favorite punctuation. Oh, and so Robert shared in the chat for us the
Yeah, sorry.
punctuation basics article. No, that's okay. It might be worth doing a whole chat on that at one point, or a whole workshop, because
Yeah.
it is like commas, M dashes, and semicolons are all very similar, but still very different, and people use them differently, and people use them incorrectly a lot.
Hmm.
So, as an editor, that's music to my eyes, I guess. Um, and Pat, a feedback Friday on adverbs. Maybe it's tough because when we do feedback Friday, we ask you to submit a particular piece, right? And Pat knows this because we've done a piece for her, but I think just looking for adverbs would be a bit of a disservice, but we could probably come up with something about adverbs. I touched on it in our dialogue workshop last month, or no, May now, 2 months ago.
Oh my gosh.
Um, but but yeah, I think adverbs deserve their own kind of talking. So
Yeah.
we'll talk about it.
I will I'll just second that.
Yeah.
M dashes are. I was terrified of them, and then I really dug deep and like tried to figure out how to use them. And now they are also my favorite in terms of punctuation because they're very powerful and they're not too complicated. Semicolons still throw me off. I turn to Doug for any semicolon problems, but
I now sometimes use too many M dashes and I have to go back and remove them. But on that note, something that I thought and didn't include, but I'll point out now, is that Renee didn't use a lot of M dashes in this work. In fact, I don't know if they used any. So, uh, as a line editor, when I was going through, my inclination was to add more M dashes, and the one that we used in the previous example was the only pair that I included, because as a line editor, it's not my job to change your writing style to my writing style. So if you hire a line editor, you don't like that's something you want to be aware of, right? If they're a professional, they should be good at this, but if they aren't that experienced, they might try and change your style to theirs. Or when you use someone who's just a writer as a beta reader, you're going to get a lot of feedback that is specific to their writing style, not how to improve your own. So
mhm.
that's, as someone giving out or getting feedback, that's something that you want to be aware of when accepting that feedback. Uh, oh, and before we move on, Lisa here. How can you describe a sensory without creating a lot of lists? I find that it ends up repetitive in my writing when I introduce a new area. One of the best ways you can do it, and Robert, I'll let you weigh in on this in a sec here, but you don't need to cluster them up. Just
Mhm.
like any detail, you don't need to just throw a whole bunch at us. Intersperse it with action, or in some cases, have your character, if we're just landing at Dabbler Station, have them encounter some kind of sensory detail or two, and then they make some progress, and then the smell hits them as they're passing by somewhere. One of the best examples I can think of is if you're walking past a bakery, you get hit with that immediate sensory detail, but it's only in that area, right? It's not the whole place, but it still adds to the overall setting. So just space it out, intersperse it with action and dialogue and other stuff, and you'll have more success that way.
Mhm.
Any thoughts from yourself, Robert?
Yeah. I think I've I've thought a lot about like what makes a rich sensory detail, and it doesn't even have to be that you have a ton of details. But I think there are two things that really stand out to me personally in terms of like what is a really great sensory detail. The first thing is I love details that have nothing to do with sight, because we're very sight driven as seeing people specifically, but we're very sight driven. Like we almost always describe what something looks like in a book, myself included. But those extra details of the smell of a bakery, I could describe what a bakery looks like to you, but you and I, if I describe like, and then I walked down the street and the smell of fresh bread on a French street, like just wafted up, and it was glorious. Like that is way more detail that you and I have a shared experience of than if I just described that it had this really cool like exterior design or something, right? Like it's just way you're suddenly there in the scene because you're smelling the bread. And so I would say lean on details that don't have to do with sight. So go with smell, go with sound, go with touch. You know, if you, in this case, if you're on a space station, there might be a thrumming through your feet or something, as like there's a generator that or something, you know, like little details like that, or even the temperature of the space. If it's cold or if you catch a wave of heat as you walk by something, or just those kinds of details are really rich. And the other thing I'd say is if you do include site details, I think what makes them rich is it's when it's something that has almost nothing to do with the character, right? So in this case, if you're on a grungy space station and the lights flicker off for a half second, that tells you so much about the space station. Like this thing is just like held together with duct tape and rubber bands. You know, like if the lights flicker off and everyone just kind of goes on normal, like nothing is different, that's a visual detail, but it has nothing to do with the character, what the character's focused on. It just gives that really good sensory detail. And so I think it has to be details that are outside of your character, not what they're thinking about, not what they're looking at, but specifically like what is around them and what is happening around them. So,
I like that. And I'm gonna say this as someone who does a lot of scene description in a first draft, but odds are your first draft has too much description.
mhm.
And you could get away with less. Even if you're writing sci-fi and fantasy, you could get away with less, at least in one big chunk. Right? Build it out over time. Um, yeah, I think those are all. I think that really hits the nail on the head. That's the second time I've said that this stream, but that's
So
okay.
we're hitting a lot of nails on the
We're
head.
hitting a lot of nails right on the head. And Pat said was thinking good or bad use of adverbs for the potential adverb workshop, not so much seek and destroy. Yes, I agree, because I've said before, adverbs have their place in writing. It's just that some adverbs tend to be a lot weaker than other things you can put in their place, including different adverbs. So, all
Mm-hmm.
right, Lisa, let us know if that answered your question too. Um, while we move on, we only have a couple more slides here that I want to show. Passive voice. This is another thing that could be a whole workshop in itself. Dabbler Station often overwhelmed me after spending the vast majority of time alone on my starship. So I want to talk about passive versus active voice real quick. And I realize we're running out of time here to just make it an hour-long show. But passive voice is when something acts on the subject of a sentence, and the subject of the sentence is what the sentence is about. So, Dabbler Station often overwhelmed me. the sentence is about me. Dabbler Station often did something to me. That makes it passive. And then because it's passive tends to be more muddled and less clear, which is what more muddled means. Uh, so after spending the vast majority of my time alone on my starship, it's not until we get to my time that we realize that that second part of the sentence is about Noir, is about our narrator, and not about Dabbler Station, because most sentence structure conventionally starts with the subject at the beginning or close to the beginning. So we're thinking Dabbler Station often overwhelmed me, and then maybe we're going to say with all of its noise and hullabaloo, right? But instead we pivot to more about Noir. So it's a weaker, slower, more muddled sentence, which sounds very critical. Like it's not like it's a terrible sentence, but we can improve it. And so here's what my feedback looks like. Again, track changes just shows you crossed out new suggestion. And so after spending so long alone on my starship, the mayhem of Dabbler Station was nearly unbearable. Right? Where it's no longer Dabbler Station doing something to Noir. We get right away that the premise is that she's been alone on the starship for long enough that when there's all of this chaos going around, and this is in the midst of her describing how terrible she thinks this place is in terms of just almost being an introvert, the mayhem of Dabbler Station was nearly unbearable versus what we had before.
Mm-hmm.
Improved, Robert?
Totally.
You don't have to pad my ego, but you can.
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah. All right. And then I want to point out again something awesome here to wrap it up, because there were a lot of, I think, small fixes that I made in this passage or in this piece, but for the big picture stuff, it was really just those few that we pointed out. But they are ones that I want people to kind of take to heart, because passive voice is something that we all struggle with overusing. Again, like adverb, there's a place for passive voice, but it's not all the places that we have put it. And that goes for almost any writer. But let's talk about how awesome this character voice is. You actually mentioned this, Robert. So pulling out and targeting someone with an inordinately expensive, prohibited, and lethal firearm was not polite, not good manners at all. But some situations just called for it. This situation did not, but I would have felt better having the option available. What really stood out to me in this line, again, you can't see my mouse, but if you focus on firearm was not polite, comma, not good manners at all, that little add-on sentence fragment there just really took this and made it more so much in Noir's voice that it's so effective at conveying who they are. So I think this was awesome. Yeah. So thank you, Renee. Really appreciate this, because this was a really cool piece to read. All of the pieces that we've had so far for Feedback Friday have been really good to read. Robert's just a sci-fi fan, so he got really excited for this one.
I did. Sorry, I have lots of thoughts about sci-fi. I think about it all day. So
I do want to shamelessly plug, as I normally do, some upcoming events. Our ones in yellow here are the premium only ones, but we have office hours next week on the 11th at 2 p.m. with myself and Hank. We have a bunch of podcasts next week, actually. The one I highlighted there is on Friday, but let me give a quick rundown of what we have streaming here on YouTube, and then, of course, wherever you digest your podcast after that. But 2 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday, the 9th, we have Mark Greeny with writing ripped from the headlines. That's thrillers that he writes. We have 3 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday, the 10th. That's Stephen James, Why Story Trumps Structure, which will be an interesting one, because I am a big believer that people should understand story structure until they know enough to break it. So I'll be really interested to see what that. And then 2 p.m. on
Doug's gonna show up ready to fight to that one.
Yeah, I'm gonna be antagonistic. On Friday, we have Randy Ingermanson, who is the person who made the snowflake method, which is one of the most intense ways you can plot a novel. And Hank's going to be talking to him for the podcast next Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. And then at the end of the month, we have a couple events in between here and then, but I want to shamelessly plug my own workshop, and we're doing a show don't tell workshop for Dabble Premium at 2 p.m. on July 30th. That's a Tuesday. So I'm excited for that one. That's such a big, important topic.
Yeah,
so,
I feel like every Feedback Friday that we've had a moment where we're like, this would be improved with show don't tell. And so
every
Yeah,
book
I'm
I've
excited.
ever edited or written can benefit from more showing and less telling. So,
Yeah.
all right.
TW says that they developed a Doug voice in their head when they write. I also have a Doug voice in my head. He's very antagonistic at times, but he's lovable. So,
Yes, that's how I balance it. All right, everybody. Well, thank you for joining us for this Feedback Friday. It was lovely having you here, and thanks again to Renee for putting this piece forward for us to provide feedback on, and hopefully we all learn something from it. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Bye for now.
see you guys.